In a forgotten stretch of land far removed from city lights and public scrutiny, there stood a cluster of high, walled compounds wrapped in silence. These weren't ordinary structures, they were religious camps that called themselves spiritual sanctuaries, dedicated to purifying the soul, breaking worldly attachments, and leading people to divine alignment. To the outsider, they looked peaceful, quiet, disciplined, but behind those fences was a truth so dark that the soil beneath the camps almost seemed to carry its weight. The women who entered these places did so voluntarily. At first, they came from all walks of life, some broken from trauma, others curious, and some just desperately hungry for purpose. These were women who wanted to reset their lives, heal from pain, or get closer to God. The recruiters who brought them in were convincing, offering promises of transformation, community, and divine favor. For many, it felt like the answer to prayers whispered through tears. But what awaited them beyond the gates was not healing. It was erasure. It began subtly. Upon entry, the women were required to surrender all personal belongings, phones, journals, photos, even their birth certificates, worldly distractions. They were told, to find yourself, you must lose yourself in God. It sounded noble, holy even, they obeyed, because faith teaches surrender. But surrender slowly turned into silence, and silence slowly turned into disappearance. Within months, letters stopped coming to their families. Phone calls that were once allowed became unspiritual. Anyone asking to leave was accused of being rebellious, tainted by the world, or worse, possessed. The fences were not meant to keep outsiders out, they were meant to keep souls trapped inside. The doctrine practiced inside these camps was not based on love or scripture, but fear and manipulation. Women were told that their past was filthy, that their bodies were shameful, and that they were nothing unless they were in total submission. They were re-educated daily through purification sessions, where they were forced to confess sins they never committed, renounce dreams they once cherished, and cut off ties with the outside world. The world is a lie. The leaders preached, your family won't understand, you are chosen for something higher. At first, these were just strange rules. But soon, they became chains. The women began to disappear from their former selves, not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally. Their names were changed. Their clothes stripped to plain garments, always the same color. Their expressions became vacant. When visitors, rare as they were, asked how the women were doing, the leaders smiled and answered, they are being purified. But their eyes told another story, a story of fear. By the time local authorities began receiving complaints, 278 women had already vanished. Officially, there were no missing persons, because these women were registered under new names, kept off government records, or worse, claimed to have left voluntarily. There were no crime scenes, no calls for help, and no evidence, just whispers. The whispers began with mothers. I haven't heard from my daughter in 18 months. My letters keep returning unopened. She was fine before she joined that place. But when they tried to speak out, they were labeled as bitter, worldly, or unsupportive of their daughter's spiritual journeys. The camps had powerful legal teams, secretive donors, and influence in local politics. Every whisper was met with a wall of denial. But whispers don't stay whispers forever. They become echoes, and echoes grow louder. One day, a woman named Lena's story went viral. Her cousin had posted a video detailing how Lena had joined a peaceful retreat 2 years prior and was never seen again. The clip featured photos, voice notes, and tearful memories. She didn't disappear. The cousin said she was erased. That one voice turned a whisper into a storm. People began comparing notes. Stories emerged from other families. Journalists dug deeper. A former camp staff member leaked internal recordings. Slowly, the fences that had guarded secrets began to tremble under the weight of truth. The most chilling part of it all was this: the camps didn't need to lock the women up. They had convinced them to stay. That's what made it so dangerous. The control wasn't enforced through chains. It was embedded through doctrine. This keynote exists not just to expose what happened, but to remind us, blind faith is not holy, it is hazardous. When we silence our doubts in the name of obedience, we leave the door open for exploitation. The fences weren't just made of steel. They were built with silence, fear, and manipulation, and the only thing that can tear them down is truth, faith. True faith is meant to liberate the soul. It's meant to uplift, to comfort, and to give light in the darkest hours. But when the sacred is distorted, when scriptures are twisted and silence replaces understanding, that same faith can become a tool of terror. Inside those religious camps where 278 women disappeared, faith was no longer a refuge, it had become a cage. And what's more horrifying than being locked in a cage, believing that the cage is holy? At first, the teachings seemed harmless. The women were told they were being brought closer to God, away from the noise of the world. They were instructed to meditate more, speak less, and reflect deeply on their sins, even sins they didn't remember committing. Gradually, those sins became identity markers. They were told they were prideful, selfish, impure, that they had been defiled by the modern world, that their dreams, voices, and ambitions were distractions planted by the devil. This wasn't correction, it was conditioning. Every day they were reminded of their supposed unworthiness. Their autonomy was seen as rebellion. Wanting to leave the camp meant they were not yet cleansed. If they questioned the teachings, they were accused of spiritual arrogance. And if they expressed pain, it was called punishment from God for hidden disobedience. The environment inside was made to slowly replace a woman's conscience with fear. Fear of punishment, fear of being cursed, fear of being abandoned by God. And the irony, this was all done in the name of saving their souls. Public shaming became routine. If a woman smiled too brightly or cried too loudly, she was summoned for correction. A circle would form around her, and she would be forced to confess something, anything, to justify her supposed rebellion. The other women were encouraged to point out each other's faults, a sisterhood built on betrayal. That was how the doctrine maintained power: divide, isolate, shame. Soon their identities began to fade. The leaders gave them new names, biblical names stripped of individuality and loaded with guilt-driven symbolism: Ruth the redeemed, Mary the broken, Tamar the humbled. But these were not titles of honor. They were labels of submission. Meals were silent. Mornings began with chants of self-denial. Nights ended with recitations of worthlessness, meant to remind them how much they needed saving. This wasn't faith. This was spiritual colonization. Fear ruled the camp, not love. They feared God, but not in the way scriptures teach. It wasn't awe or reverence. It was the belief that one wrong move would mean eternal damnation or public humiliation. They feared their leaders. They feared disappointing them, questioning them, even looking them in the eye. The fear was so deeply rooted that many women eventually stopped thinking altogether. They became empty vessels, saying what they were told to say, thinking what they were told to think. And the worst part, they began to believe it was all for their good. They wrote letters home saying, "I'm finding peace," but the handwriting shook with desperation. They smiled during rare video calls, but their eyes were hollow. They repeated, "I'm being purified," but they could no longer define who they were before the process began. When families tried to intervene, the leaders labeled them as enemies of God. They told the women that their families wanted to drag them back into sin. And because their minds had been so reshaped, the women began to believe it. Mothers were blocked. Fathers' calls went unanswered. Sisters' emails were filtered out. The women had not just disappeared physically, they had been emotionally cut off from reality. And this is how faith becomes fear, not overnight, not with chains, but with carefully chosen scriptures taken out of context, with repetition, with manipulation, with the slow, strategic replacement of truth with obedience. Faith, when twisted, becomes the most dangerous weapon in the world. It doesn't need guns or violence. It uses guilt. It uses isolation. It uses shame wrapped in verses and control disguised as discipline. But even in this darkness, a few lights never went out. A few women held onto something deep inside, a small voice that whispered, "This isn't what God intended." And that whisper, no matter how faint, was the beginning of resistance. Because even when fear tries to drown faith, truth always leaves a trail, and for some, that trail would eventually lead to freedom. But before that could happen, the system of fear had to be fully exposed for what it was. Not religion, not holiness, but control disguised as divine will. Her name was Amira, and though her voice had been silenced for years inside the camp walls, her courage would become the loudest echo of resistance the world had heard in decades. Amira entered the camp when she was just 18, bright-eyed, brave, and beautifully lost. Her mother had died the year before, her father had remarried quickly, and she felt like the world had no room for her anymore. So when she came across a group of women preaching about purpose, healing, and divine renewal, she listened. They told her she was special, that she was chosen, that God had a plan for her, but only if she left everything behind and followed them into a life of spiritual discipline. She said yes, not because she was weak, because she was hungry for meaning. The first few weeks felt warm, structured, purposeful. She woke up to morning prayers, read devotional passages, and shared meals with women who called each other sisters. But slowly, that warmth faded, and what was left in its place was cold, silent control. Amira wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to. Her journal was confiscated. Her questions were dismissed. Her dreams were labeled worldly distractions. When she asked if she could visit her younger brother, she was told family was a temptation sent by the devil. When she cried, she was told her tears were the cleansing of the soul. And when she tried to leave, she was locked in a room for 3 days and given nothing but water and scripture. From that moment on, she understood this wasn't a spiritual retreat. It was a prison disguised as paradise, but even prisons have cracks. And Amira found hers. In the silence of those nights, she began observing everything. Who guarded the gates when the lights were switched off, where the keys were kept, which women were too afraid to talk, and which ones might still have fire left in their hearts. She wasn't just surviving, she was planning. It took her 11 months to gather the courage, not because she lacked bravery, but because every day inside that camp stripped her of her identity, her voice, her right to even think for herself. But deep inside, the voice of her mother echoed, "You were not born to bow to fear." And so one night, when the sky was darker than usual and a storm had knocked out part of the fence's electric current, she ran. Barefoot, soaked, terrified, free, the rain fell like judgment from heaven, but she ran anyway. Every crack of thunder felt like a warning shot. Every branch she stepped on felt like it would give her away. Behind her, alarms began to sound. The leaders had discovered her absence. Flashlights pierced through the trees. Voices screamed her name, not with love, but with rage. "Come back, Amira, this is for your soul." But she didn't stop. Because for the first time in years, she remembered what it felt like to be alive. Her feet bled, her throat burned, her body begged her to collapse, but her soul pushed forward, because if she didn't make it out, no one else ever would. If she gave up, 277 other names would remain lost in silence. She made it to a road. She stumbled onto the shoulder and collapsed near a tiny church at the edge of a forgotten town. A janitor found her lying there, shaking, whispering over and over, "They're not camps, they're cages, please, help the others." That whisper, trembling and fragile, became the spark that would ignite the investigation. Amira's story hit the news like wildfire. People listened, not because she was a professional speaker, not because she had perfect words, but because she had survived what others couldn't escape. Through her testimony, investigators launched a raid. Survivors were pulled from multiple compounds. Families began to recognize names. Mothers wept at the sound of their daughters' voices. And most importantly, the world could no longer pretend these camps were simply religious retreats. They were human rights violations wearing a cross. But Amira never saw herself as a hero. "I just didn't want to die without being heard," she told a reporter. "If I stayed, I wouldn't just disappear, I'd forget who I ever was." And that's the heart of her story. Her escape wasn't just physical. It was spiritual warfare. A battle for memory, for identity, for the sacred right to choose your own voice, your own truth, and your own path to God. Amira taught the world a lesson that has echoed through time. Silence is not always peace. Discipline is not always devotion, and blind obedience is never the path to God. Her escape was more than a rescue. It was a revolution. What's in a name? To some, it's just a word, a label used to call someone across a room. But for those who have ever been forgotten, silenced, or erased, a name is far more than a sound. It's memory, it's identity, it's proof that you existed, that you mattered, that you were once loved and never truly lost. After Amira's escape and the launch of investigations, a heartbreaking discovery began to surface. Out of the 278 women who had disappeared inside the religious camps, the majority no longer had legal identities. Their birth certificates had been taken, their official documents either destroyed or never updated. Their names had been changed, some to biblical titles, others to generic phrases like Sister of Purity or Servant of the Spirit. The erasure wasn't just spiritual, it was systematic. And this wasn't accidental, this was deliberate doctrine, a doctrine that taught that the self was sinful, that individuality was rebellion, that the past life must be burned like chaff to make room for sanctification. So they stripped away names, they called it spiritual rebirth, but in truth it was identity theft disguised as salvation. When authorities tried to track these women down, they hit walls. There were no records. No files, no last, known addresses. In legal terms, these women no longer existed. They were ghosts in a system that had once promised them light. But something remarkable happened. Families didn't give up. Mothers clung to handwritten notes. Fathers searched through childhood photos, voice recordings, and birth certificates. Friends gathered school yearbooks, tagged old social media photos, remembered laughter shared at bus stops, and whispered secrets in dorm rooms. And one by one, names began returning to the world. Eliza Mahmoud, Nura Khan, Sarah Ghaffar, Lina Satter, Mariam Balok, Hiba Qureshi. Each name was like a light being turned back on. One by one, these names were engraved on a massive steel wall erected in the center of the capital. It was called the Wall of the Lost Daughters. People came from all over the country to see it. Some brought flowers, some left candles, others simply stood and whispered the names aloud, because to say a name is to resurrect it. A young woman stood in front of the wall with trembling hands and said, "That's my sister. She disappeared when I was 13. I never stopped saying her name, even when everyone told me to let go." And that's the power of a name. In the camps, the leaders had worked hard to convince the women that their past selves were evil, that their names were attached to shame, that in order to be holy, they had to be anonymous. It wasn't just a spiritual tactic. It was psychological warfare, but the truth is this: a name holds more than history. It holds potential, it holds purpose, and no system, no camp, no doctrine, no matter how well funded or fear-driven, can erase what has been written on the soul of a human being. When some of the rescued women saw their birth names again for the first time, they wept. "I forgot I was Ayesha." One survivor whispered, "They told me she was dead, but she's not. She's still here. I am her." Another woman said, "They gave me a new name and said it was holy, but I now know the holiest thing I ever had was the name my mother gave me when she held me for the first time." These weren't just sentimental statements. They were declarations of war against erasure. Restoring names became a mission. Volunteers, human rights workers, and digital archivists came together to trace every lead. Old school IDs, family stories, health records, even childhood nicknames were pieced together like a puzzle to recover the names that had been wiped away. And every name recovered was another step toward justice. Toward healing, toward wholeness, the movement began to grow. People started tagging posts with #SayHerNameAgain. Documentaries were made. Schools added the case of the 278 women to curriculum on spiritual abuse and identity protection. Laws were proposed to prevent any organization from altering a person's legal name without transparent and voluntary consent. Because now the world understood, a name is sacred. It is the first gift we are given. It connects us to our roots, our ancestors, and our destinies. When someone takes that away, they are not just stealing identity. They are attempting to rewrite your existence, but these women were not rewritten. They were restored, and the wall of names continues to grow, not just as a memorial of loss, but as a symbol of resistance, because in the end, the most powerful rebellion against silence is to say the name. It didn't happen in a single day. It didn't start with screaming headlines or global outrage. It started with silence, and it survived because the world looked away. The disappearance of 278 women wasn't carried out by an army, a political regime, or a declared enemy of the state. It happened quietly inside high-walled compounds called religious sanctuaries, in remote valleys and borderlands where roads rarely led and news rarely reached. These were places cloaked in prayer, silence, and tradition, places where no one dared to question, because questioning meant disrespecting what was seen as holy, and so it was easy to turn the other way. The doctrine that erased them thrived in the shadows. Every red flag, every unanswered call, unopened letter, every trembling family member who asked, "Have you heard from my daughter?" was ignored, dismissed, or worse, justified. It's a religious choice. She's probably on a spiritual retreat. She wanted to disconnect. These weren't answers. They were excuses dressed as tolerance. The camps had power, not the kind that screamed for attention, but the kind that hid behind reverence. They claimed to offer redemption. They called themselves places of divine discipline. Leaders quoted scripture. They prayed publicly. They dressed modestly, and for years their masks went unchallenged, because who would dare question a place that seemed to worship God? But the truth was, they weren't worshiping God. They were worshiping control. Inside those compounds, women were being silenced, starved, stripped of identity, and told they were nothing without the approval of their leaders. And yet no one saw it, not because it wasn't happening, but because seeing it would require acknowledging that faith can be weaponized, that spiritual language can become chains, that even places wrapped in prayer shawls can become prisons. It's uncomfortable to admit that abuse can wear a cross, that trauma can hide behind holy titles, so society looked away. Governments avoided confrontation, calling it a private matter of religious freedom. Law enforcement hesitated, unsure how to separate faith from fanaticism. Even human rights groups were slow to intervene, worried they'd be accused of intolerance or prejudice. And while the world debated, women disappeared. Lena, Miriam, Eliza, Sarah, they became shadows. And those who loved them screamed into silence, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. The truth is, the world didn't just fail them through inaction, it failed them through apathy. A journalist once asked Amira, the woman who escaped, what hurt the most, the abuse or the isolation? She answered without hesitation, the isolation, because when I prayed someone would come, no one did, not even once. And that is the wound that still bleeds, the realization that the world knew something was wrong, but chose to turn the page instead of read between the lines. But silence doesn't last forever. Eventually, pain becomes a voice, and one voice becomes a movement. Amira's escape shattered the silence. Her voice, fragile but firm, was carried through media, into courtrooms, through government halls, and across oceans. And slowly, people began to ask the hard questions. They began to investigate, to challenge, to hold those in power accountable. It was late, far too late for many, but it was not too late to stop the erasure from continuing. The world that once looked away began to open its eyes, and what it saw could never be unseen. Suddenly, documentaries were being filmed. Activists took to the streets. Faith leaders who once remained quiet began to denounce the camps openly. A law was passed banning any religious institution from seizing personal identification without government oversight. Shelters were built for survivors. Education campaigns were launched to teach spiritual discernment and awareness of religious abuse. But perhaps the greatest change was this: people started listening. When a mother came forward and said, "My daughter is in one of those places," she was no longer met with skepticism. She was met with action. When a woman whispered, "I think I'm in danger, but I'm afraid to leave," she was no longer alone. She was rescued. The world that once turned away now turned toward the truth. Because once you've seen how doctrine can destroy, you no longer protect appearances. You protect people. Let this keynote be a reminder. Faith without accountability is a breeding ground for abuse. And when the world looks away in the name of peace, it often protects the very systems that cause the most pain. To those who were lost in the silence, your stories were not in vain. To those who now seek, keep watching, keep questioning, keep standing, because somewhere someone else is whispering for help. And this time we must not look away. They told her she was nobody. They told her to forget who she was. They told her that her name, her voice, her dreams, none of it mattered, and for a while she believed them, so did the others. That's how it begins. Erasure doesn't happen with violence first. It begins with a whisper planted like a seed. You are not enough. You don't matter. You need us to define you. And once that seed grows, the system waters it with fear, shame, and isolation until a person no longer recognizes themselves in the mirror. But here's the truth that shattered every lie. No one has the right to erase you. Not a leader, not a doctrine, not a belief system. No one. The 278 women who disappeared into the religious camps were not just physically taken. They were spiritually and emotionally dismantled. They were told their value depended on silence, that obedience meant surrendering not just control, but identity, that if they truly loved God, they would dissolve into nothingness. But what kind of God requires erasure? What kind of faith demands you forget who you are to prove your worth? Real faith never erases. It elevates. Real love never silences. It listens. Real leadership never demands blind obedience. It encourages truth. And so the message that rose from this tragedy is not just a warning, but a call to every soul still struggling to hold on to themselves. Never let anyone erase you, not the world, not the noise, not even those who claim to know what's best for you. Because your story matters, your thoughts matter, your dreams matter, you matter. Amira escaped, yes, but more importantly, she reclaimed herself. She didn't just run from a place, she returned to who she was before fear took over. That journey, the one back to self, is perhaps the most heroic path anyone can walk, and it doesn't only belong to her. Many of the women who survived the camps shared similar stories. They had forgotten how to speak without permission, how to cry without shame, how to dream without guilt. But with every passing day outside those walls, they stitched together the pieces of their old selves. Some began painting again. Others wrote poems. A few stood before crowds and shared their stories, hands shaking, voices cracking. But they spoke. Because when you speak after being silenced, your words carry the weight of freedom. And that's why the most dangerous thing you can ever do to an oppressive system is this. Remember who you are. When they tell you to sit down, stand. When they tell you to stay quiet, sing. When they call you broken, remind them you are rebuilding. When they change your name, reclaim your own, because your existence is not a mistake. It is not a sin. It is not something to hide. You were not created to shrink. You were not born to bow. You are here on purpose with purpose. That's why oppressive systems work so hard to erase people, because a soul that remembers its own power cannot be controlled. Let this be your mirror if you've forgotten. You are more than what others have done to you. You are not the label they gave you. You are not the silence they forced upon you. You are not the fear they fed you. You are a survivor, a speaker, a warrior, a witness, so whether your story is public or still whispered in secret, don't let it die, don't hide it in shame. Your story is your resistance, your truth is your shield. The camps may have erased names, but they could not erase the fire. That fire lives on in every woman who dared to walk out, in every family who never stopped searching, in every ally who dared to believe the whispers were real. This is not just about 278 women, it's about all of us. Every person who has ever been told to stay small. Every soul who was told they were too much, too loud, too broken, too different. Every voice that was once silenced by systems pretending to be sacred. This story is your story and your name. It is a declaration. It is a banner. It is a defiance against forgetting. So wear it like armor. Speak it like thunder. Write it in the sky if you have to, but never let anyone erase you again. Because erasure is not holy, obedience is not identity, and silence is not peace. You are still here, you still matter, and the world needs the real you, loud, whole, unafraid.